All right, we're back again. Yet again, another episode of Spooky Software. We cannot be stopped. I know it's been a while, but we're back. And we have a different background this time. Everything has changed. Everything is new. And today we're going to be talking about something I'm super excited about, which is JavaScript Bundlers, right? So this is a term you probably heard on the internet for sure. If you're in like the web development space, have done any kind of like JavaScript anything in the last 10 years, you probably have to deal with this thing. So bundlers come in a variety of shapes. There's quite a number of them. The most popular and the one that we're going to be using in this video, the one I'm also most well acquainted with, is Webpack. But there are other ones as well. There's like Rollup, which is another popular one, Parcel. There's kind of newfangled ones that are actually not written in JavaScript, like ESBuild, Packs, etc. They all kind of do the same thing. They all kind of solve the same problems. They have slightly different feature sets. They do it a slightly different way. They have slightly different design choices, etc. But for the most part, they all kind of hover around the same ideas. And so we're going to cover those ideas in this video. And hopefully it won't be a super long video. We're not going to cover everything that, for instance, Webpack can do. And that's kind of why I've decided to make this video is, JavaScript tooling in general can be somewhat overwhelming, dense, confusing. There's a lot of tools and they tend to overlap. And in my experience, people get confused about where the lines are drawn and, which tool is solving which problems. So in this one, we're just going to be focusing on just the bundler. And the bundler is, it's kind of the backbone usually of sort of the whole kind of build and package your web app for production build infrastructure, right? So let's kind of delve in with that. And so, of course, I have built myself like a little tiny application, and this is just an application that runs in the browser, and it's really simple, but there's no server component or anything like this. This is just JavaScript that runs in your browser with a little bit of HTML. And the idea is it's a calculator, right? So, you type in some numbers like 5 and 20 and it'll add for them and display an output. And so this kind of captures, everything that any application would want to do, right? Is that it has some input, it has some output, and does some computation in the middle, right? I'm a well-meaning application developer. I want to take this application that I've written and I want to distribute it. I want it to be available for people. I want to build it, package it, put it on the web, right? The question is, how do I do that? And what kind of problems do I encounter when I try to? So that's kind of where this bundler comes in is, I have JavaScript that I've written and I want to package it, right? So let's just take a look at the source code thus far, right? It really is pretty simple here. Probably the sort of start here is this HTML. There's really nothing special here. There's that form that we were just looking at, and then at the very end we've got some script, right? And this is just loaded using the browser's like built-in script tag. We're loading some files, and I'm going to start to use this word module, but it's not quite applicable here yet, and we'll get into that. I might just be using this word because it's the word that I use all the time, right? But basically, I have 3 source files, and that's just for my own organization, right? If we take a look at the tree again, I've just kind of split my code up into these 3 files, and I've imported them, if you will, just by putting script tags, right? And again, just so that we can kind of see what's going on here, this is the entire app, right? It gets some elements off the page, it adds in a submit handler to that form, does some computation and displays an output, right? That's the whole app. However, already we have some things going on here, right? Which is these functions convert to number, add, and set output HTML. These are not like built-in functions to JavaScript. These are functions that I wrote, and I put them in a different file from src index just for my own sanity. So let's take a look at math, right? So here's a quote-unquote module. Now, this is module is probably, in pedantic terms, the wrong word to use here. This is technically not a module, at least not yet. But it's just like a file where I've put a collection of functions and a constant in this case. So I have a function that adds and one subtracts, and a constant called pi, right? And then I have another file here, HTML, which does some conversions to numbers, some marshalling, etc. And then I have a function that does some output, right? And by the way, look at this. We will fix this in this video. Please don't do this code. This code is really bad. There's security problems with this, but I would be remiss if I didn't point that out. So we've got all this stuff, but it's not ideal, right? And maybe in this really, really small case where I only have 3 files and a couple of functions, like it's fine, but there's like some problems here. So number one, I've written all these functions, which is nice, but they exist on the global scope, right? So window in the browser is kind of like you can just put whatever you want on there at any time, and it's just available globally. The name convert to number has been assigned to this function, and sort of anybody can read it and use that function, but like it's in the global scope, right? And if you have any experience writing programs in any programming language, like global whatever should make you kind of nervous, right? And that's definitely true in the browser as well, right? And at the same time, if we kind of look at that HTML file again, let's look at this. There's another subtle thing here, which is that for this program to work, these have to be actually loaded in the correct order, right? So there was some dependencies in this file to functions that were defined in these files, right? So there's some kind of ordering here. We actually talked about this in a previous video on Terraform, and it's actually the same problem. It's a dependency graph, right? So I had to like manually know that, like, and sort of by my own knowledge, know that like, oh, well, index.js must be loaded after these two. I guess in this case, it doesn't really matter if we load HTML or math first, but it definitely matters that we load both of these after index. Otherwise, like, we might run into problems. That variable, like those functions that we were using, for instance, convert to number, haven't been defined until, this file finishes loading. So if this one, tries to use it before it's ready to go, that's a problem, right? And so now we kind of get into where bundlers are and what they're for, right? Finally, there's one more problem with this, which isn't necessarily a problem here, although it certainly would be in a very large app with many, many modules, is this is pretty inefficient for, at least for HTTP version 1, right? Or version 1.1, depending. It just turns out that the way that like TCP and of course HTTP on top of that works, small requests like this tend to be really inefficient, and like, we want this application to be ready and loaded as quickly as possible, and show something to the user and get it going as quickly as possible. If we had like 100 modules, there's all kinds of problems, like I think the browser can only make like 6 requests at a time to like one URL. We technically have to run each one of these files sequentially. It's a whole thing, right? So, and I'm not going to delve too much into that. There's plenty of content on the web, or maybe we'll make another video just discussing that. But it would be more ideal if like we could just make like one request and actually kind of get all 3 of those files in one request. Now, in 2021, when this is recorded, there may be some new things that are going into browsers that may help this, like, for instance, HTTP 2 or even 3, and quick protocols, etc. Maybe you can put special tags or attributes on your source tags like async and defer to sort of help this issue. But overall, it's not ideal. We have this like sort of ordering ahead of line where HTML blocks math, and then math blocks index, and et cetera, right? So we want a way to kind of put everything together. And that's actually where this word bundler comes from, is we basically take all of our JavaScript, all of our modules, and we bundle it together into like one file called a bundle, right? All right, so let's actually do that. So I have like a main branch where this is exactly what I did. So I think if I do git diff without bundler, we'll see the difference, right? So you can see that, I've deleted these 3 imports, and I've just imported this one file called bundle, right? And again, if I do this tree business, there is no bundle.js file anywhere. That is going to be an artifact. That's going to be something we're going to create sort of during a build process, right? So let's go back to that diff. And I've also changed the syntax of how I've defined things that are quote unquote exported and how things are imported, right? So for instance, in the HTML module, I have set export function and then a name, export function, etc. And here you can see I'm importing those 2 modules. I've said, oh, I need these functions from HTML and I need this function from math. Same thing here. Same thing here. I've just kind of changed the syntax of how I've defined these things. So no longer are these functions, constants, etc. on the global scope. And I've also explicitly written into my source code a dependency graph. I've said inside index.js, I depend on math and HTML with these import statements. Small side note here. This syntax is actually officially called like the ES module spec. This is just one way to write syntactically a dependency and modules, right? So JavaScript didn't have modules in the spec. They are sort of a new thing in the last like 5 years or so. If you're coming from like Node or you've used any NPM module in the last like 20 years, you're probably familiar with a slightly different syntax, which is called CommonJS with the require function. And just for demonstration purposes, I just show you that real quick. So it would be, you'd see things like this module dot exports, equals function, whatever. So this is the syntax for exporting, and then the syntax for importing is like something equals require, right? Other code, right? And so these 2 things together kind of produce the same idea, which is a way to specify dependencies, right? This is called CommonJS, and it is what Node uses to this day. And also, most of the bundlers that you will find support both syntaxes and even mixing and matching. Turns out that a lot of the NPM modules you download will still use CommonJS, and that's another problem that a bundler can solve, is not only can it understand ES module syntax, but it can also understand CommonJS and sort of seamlessly bring them together when it produces this bundle file. So anyway, the only other thing I want to look at is, I'll just get rid of that file, is package.json, which I have only asked for 2 dependencies, Webpack and the Webpack CLI. And the CLI is just so that I can use it from the command line. So I'm just going to install that. And while that's going, hopefully it's pretty quick. We can take a gander. Oh, it's actually almost done, so we'll just wait here. Great. So the only other thing I want to take a look at is the Webpack config file. So I think Webpack has some defaults, and you technically don't even need this file, although I would highly recommend you use one. Really, the fundamental thing, the fundamental configuration that Webpack has, I want you to ignore everything in this file except for these 4 lines right here. 5 lines, sorry. So the kind of fundamental thing that you're going to configure in Webpack is what we call an entry point. You can have as many as you need, but in our case, we only have 1. And an output, right? And so we actually discussed this output a little bit already. This synthetic file bundle.js does not exist. It will be created when we invoke Webpack. And this is just some configuration of like, what's the file name and where do I put that file, right? So we're going to put it in the /dist folder, right? It stands for distribution. I'm going to distribute to this, right? This entry, we'll talk about it in just a moment, but our entry point is sort of the first file, the root module, if you will, that Webpack is going to read to create this bundle thing. So we can imagine, and we'll look at this pictorially in a moment, we can imagine that our first sort of dependency is, our root dependency, if you will, is this source index, right? That is our application, right? Let's just print that again just for clarity, right? This is our real application, right? But of course, this has modules. And then, these modules might have their own dependencies and so forth, right? So Webpack is going to start by reading this file, find all of its dependencies, and kind of go from there. Let's actually look at look at this pictorially. So I'll switch over to my iPad. We've got a diagram. Everybody loves diagrams, right? So this is just pictorially exactly this dependency graph that we've been talking about, right? So I've drawn it such that index.js, which is a quote unquote our root module, our entry, right? Our Webpack entry, it depends on two things, HTML.js and Math.js, right? And that's it. These two modules tend to actually, as of today, have no dependencies. And there is no dependency between Math and HTML. So in a sense, these two are kind of topologically in the same kind of load order, right? And this is just another way of displaying the same data, which is, I can kind of orient these modules, these dependencies in this way. So just like I had to do this by hand in the index.html in our original application, this is kind of like what Webpack is doing automatically, right? It's reading these files one by one. It's going to read index.html. Notice that, hey, I need html.js and I need math. Let me go read those files. And it turns out those don't have any further dependencies, but they totally could. And it's going to kind of order this topologically and make sure that all of these modules are sort of resolved, that they truly exist, right? And then make sure that they're loaded in the correct order. And then finally, it's going to kind of take all this stuff and it's going to shove it into, in our case, bundle.js, right? And once that is built, then our application can run just using this thing. So in fact, let's go ahead and actually just run the Webpack bundler, right? Let's actually run our quote unquote build step. So if I go yarn run Webpack, oh wow, okay, so it did its work, and you can see that it was reading all the modules that I have included in my bundle. And now I'm not gonna list everything, but you can see I have this new kind of synthetic file called bundle.js, just like I asked for. And if I take a look at this bundle file, now I'm not gonna go into the exact details of what's going on here, but suffice to say, it is a little bit of an implementation detail of Webpack. It seems confusing because there's lots of comments and things everywhere, and these weird functions like webcap underscore require underscore, whatever, dunder, it's a whole thing. But you can see that it's something like the code that I wrote, in that there's an entry for every single module in my bundle, right? There's this HTML module, there's this math module, right? And you can see that, it's got some of my exports, right? Pi and add and, sub and all these things, right? And then this kind of code in the middle, I'm not going to delve into exactly what this is, but essentially it's just a place to load modules, right? So each one of these entries has a name, it's a string name, and this code right here is responsible for turning a string name into real code. And of course, finally, you can see that here's kind of our index, our entry, and here's the, all this thing. And Webpack has replaced my function calls to that name convert to number to some kind of Webpack import thing, right? And again, I don't want to focus too much on the details of this file. It's not necessarily important unless, you're debugging some kind of crazy problem, but the idea is that Webpack sort of looked at this dependency graph and generated this bundle, generated all this module entries and the code that loads those entries, and made sure that they appeared in the correct order. So you notice that, hey, look, before this code runs, Webpack will automatically make sure that these two files are imported, right? And of course, replace them with the imported version, right? And again, coming back to this problem of like global namespace, right? So Webpack modules, as you know, as well as ES modules, if you will, they have their own namespace. Actually, each one of these is inside of a function. So you can see that like right here is an open function. Here's a close function. So all of these names are not in the global namespace. They are attached to like a module, and you have to get that module from somewhere, right? And that, again, that is an implementation detail of Webpack of how that loading actually occurs. We don't think about it too hard. We just build this file and, you know, kind of go from there. So now, if I refresh this, we have the exact same thing as we did before. It's a thing that does some math, but you see that we're only loading one file, this bundle.js, right? And everything kind of works, right? Automatically. If I like reorder things or rearrange things or create new modules, new dependencies, Webpack will just continue to produce this bundle.js without problems, right? All right, and sort of as a final to sort of cherry on top to sort of really drive home how important this kind of automatic dependency management actually is, we're going to use an npm module. So not all the modules that you use in your application, you know, you will have written, right? You may have used some third-party open source code or whatever. And so we actually saw this earlier where I have this problem where like I have some XSS in my code, right? And so this is sanitized input. I don't know what this string is. It could have like script tags in it. It could have anything in it. So this is like no good. So what I'd like to do, and I actually have a prepared branch for this, so we'll go ahead and do this, is I'd like to use a npm module called Sanitize Html. This is a popular library you can use to sanitize HTML before you put it on the page, but I just want to make sure I sanitize this thing, and I need to grab that, so I'll go ahead and install that. You can see that all I've done is ask for a new dependency in package JSON, imported the thing, and used it, right? But I do want to take a glance at this yarn.log file. You can see that Sanitize HTML actually has a lot of dependencies, right? It's got DOM utils and HTML parsers and escape string regular expression and, you know, whatever, right? So this dependency graph that we were looking at earlier where we only had 3 boxes has now become quite large, right? And it's actually so large I can't keep it in my head, right? I don't know the order. So for me to like go back into index.html in our original application and make sure that all these files are loaded and loaded in the correct order is like already no longer tenable, and I've only got one npm module, right? So let's go ahead and invoke Webpack again. And again, it's just reading this thing, and you can see that you know, it took a little longer because there's a little bit more code, and you know, it did all the things. So if I look at, let's close this. I don't want to see this anymore. If I look at this thing, it's going to be considerably different. You can see that, oh, look, so some of these modules now, their names have like node module in them, right? And like, there's a lot, right? You can see, I think this is probably going to be a couple thousand lines of code already, just to sanitize HTML. And again, this dependency graph is like crazy already. So, but like me as an application developer, I don't want to think about that. So I just like refresh. I have this new bundle, and like, you know, suddenly this is like sanitized, and you know, everything is fine, right? So yeah, so that's what a bundler is, right? It's this thing that deals with dependencies. It sort of implements modules, you know, for some definition of modules, right? Like it makes sure that all of these files have their own namespace. It makes sure they're loaded, and they're loaded in the correct order. And it packages all into like one file for efficiency from a network perspective. Now, we have only just scratched the surface as far as like what Webpack is capable of, and what people use bundlers for, and I recognize that, but I wanted to keep this very tight, very concise, and just show exactly what the bundler does and nothing more. there are, you probably have seen like, things about plugins and loaders and, well, what if we deal with files that are not JavaScript, like images, right? Our application might have images and pictures and SVGs and CSS, right? We don't have any CSS except for some inline CSS that we wrote into the HTML. We might have all kinds of dependencies of our web application, and these are also dependencies, right? Even though they're not JavaScript. And so Webpack has other ways of dealing with those files, and some of those may require plugins or special configuration for them, right? Additionally, some of the JavaScript that we write in our source code might be like a version of the source code that the browsers that we want to target, our users might be using older or worse browsers or something. So maybe we write JavaScript that isn't exactly the same kinds of JavaScript that we ship, or maybe we're using TypeScript, right? Because we want static analysis, but TypeScript doesn't run in the browser, only JavaScript does, right? So in addition to all this, we may be configuring the bundler to process certain kinds of files with like loaders, plugins, etc. By default, they only understand JavaScript, right? They only understand JavaScript and usually only the ES module syntax and sometimes the CommonJS syntax. Additionally, there's other things you want to do when you ship a bundle for production, like minify the code. You saw that, like this has lots of junk in it, comments, white space, probably has unused functions. Like even in my simple application, we saw that, like I never use the sub or the pi module. So like, I don't want these to go into the bundle because they're unused. So there are other things that a bundler can sort of orchestrate without necessarily doing itself. All right, so that's kind of all I wanted to cover today. Hopefully this is straightforward and easy. It probably, like I said, it probably will become part of a larger mini series where we cover more of the JavaScript tooling infrastructure, but this is kind of the backbone, the starting point. And again, this is all the bundler does out of the box. I only have one dependency called Webpack. I don't have any loaders. I don't have any of that stuff. This is just the bare minimum. All right, thanks for watching.